Good evening and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. Tonight we discuss the latest Annual State of Education Report, or ASER, a report prepared by independent NGO Pratham, which looks at children studying in rural schools in districts across India. It's the largest survey of its kind in the world. What are the results? Well, the big picture, 96% of India's children are now in school. The bad news, many of them can't read or add or even do simple subtraction. For instance, 25% of children in class 8 can't even read a class 2 text. For more on this, joining me tonight, Rukmini Banerjee of ASER. She's with Pratham and they of course have prepared this report. Also with me, Professor Abhijit Banerjee. He's at MIT, he's the Ford professor there and an economist and author of the book Poor Economics. I'm also joined by Pallam Raju, former Minister for HRD in the UPA government, 2014, the year of the surveys when he was minister. Also with me, Sanjay Kaul of the BJP, whose interest is in issues of education. Rukmini Banerjee, I said briefly in my introduction, the big picture. What are the lessons that India's policymakers, educationists, parents need to glean from this report?
I think if we look back over the last 10 years, we see fairly steady trends. We see that school facilities, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of teachers, have been steadily going up. And now we are in a position where I think that many schools have some of the basics that they need. Of course, there is still more to be done. But if we look at basic learning, things like just basic reading, basic arithmetic, we are kind of stuck and in some cases actually going down.
Going down the decline is quite rapid in fact.
The decline is quite rapid and much more for math. And for math, I don't mean any high-level math. Number recognition, number knowledge, simple addition, subtraction, things like this. So I think where we are at today is that we know how to solve our infrastructure problems. We know how to solve input issues. We know how to get out of school children into school because we have almost 97% of children in school and staying in school. What we really need to focus on is how do we get children to learn better. And I think that is the big challenge that we as a country have to face for the next coming years.
So Professor Banerjee, is it a travesty then of what education actually means in India today? Have we put the cart before the horse? Would you have actually preferred, do you feel this is a necessary rite of passage that first the right to education came in, we made it a fundamental right, gave the buildings and the learning comes later, or do you think we've actually got it all backwards?
I think that, we could have, I certainly think that we could have had a right to education that was about education. I think a right to education that's about buildings is an odd right to education. And I think I don't know that we shouldn't have had a right. I'm not at all saying that. I'm saying that we should have a right, but the right should have been based on measuring outcomes, on whether children are learning. If we're going to promise education, we should promise education. It's really, in some sense, this is a very dangerous thing to do because you have a bunch of people who think that going to school and going to school with the right building and the right toilet and all that constitutes education. Then, of course, they don't get a job. And then at some point we'll get a blowback. I think this is creating a time bomb in my view.
Pallam Raju, the survey of course is for 2014 when you were HRD minister. When you hear Professor Abhijit Banerjee saying in a sense that we're sitting on a time bomb, that we've got 96% of our children in school, but they're coming out uneducated as it were, what's the prospects that lie ahead for them for jobs, for employability? Do you think the RT has been flawed in its vision, that it needs to change? You can be franker now that you're out of government.
Yes, I totally stand by the promulgation of the RTE Act. I think it was a measure that we had to do and that has certainly accelerated the process. Maybe the learning outcomes haven't been to the expectation levels, but I think they are creeping along in the right direction and I'm certain that with greater focus from the states, we will be able to make a bigger and better impact in the coming years.
What was the biggest challenge? Because, for instance, the sharp decline we saw, and I think that was the big surprise in last year's report, that there was a sharp decline in quality of learning, of how much actually class 3 and primary students could actually do in rural India, whether it was simple reading or simple maths. What was the big surprise? Do you think it was because actually testing was done away with? There's no measurement of what children are learning in school.
See, I think the biggest challenge has been the availability of teachers. And I think that has not been commensurate with which we've expanded on the infrastructure of schools. But having said that, I also want to, talk about the National Assessment Survey that is done by the ministry, which has certain findings which are a little different from what Pratham does. And we believe that's a much more scientific survey that is done in schools as against Pratham's survey, which is a dipstick survey that's done in the villages. Of course, I don't want to say that, everything is rosy. Certainly there are shortcomings and we need to accelerate the process. And I think the biggest challenge was the availability of teachers. And I'm sure that still is a challenge today.
So I'm going to get Rukmini in on that, but Sanjay Kaul, if you can comment on that, underlining the Prime Minister's whole Make in India vision, the thrust on manufacturing, the thrust on skill development will be a primary education. I mean, that's really the building block. If we're failing at this stage, what do you think needs to be really done to fix that? What is the new government's vision starting from the very basic?
Yes, of course. I mean, if you were to look at the entire lifespan, productive lifespan of a human being, you will naturally, you could end up at employability, but you'll have to start with primary education. And we know that this has been a blighted area for a long time. But I think it's also because, to a large extent, in spite of the fact that the RT intended to do what it did finally, which is all very well, but I think the input orientation of the Act is basically proving eventually going to be detrimental, because the focus has to shift to outcomes. And you see, it's really a repeat of the supervisory idea of how education should be delivered, which is actually taking out a lot of energy, entrepreneurship, and juice out of the system. If you were to bring that back, a lot of people would be able to actually find local solutions, because at the end of the day, I think parents are best equipped to evaluate whether their kids are getting a good education or not. If you get regulations to help assist instead of obstruct, you would probably get that much faster. And now that's very important for us, because it's not a question of just filling in the numbers and having, for instance, clocking a higher degree of admissions, but it is really what you're getting out of those schools that's going to determine whether they move up in classes or whether they finally end up doing college and getting jobs. So I absolutely agree with you, and I think all of the things that we are planning as far as the NDA is concerned rests on the solid foundation that we need to place. Needs to be in place. But I also think that it requires not just infrastructural but entrepreneurial energies and application of mind in trying to simplify and to let the system sort of get off the ground and not become bogged down in whether for instance in Delhi, let me just put it, because I spent some time looking at private schools. And we also learned from your report that the private schools are probably doing better than government schools. I also know that, for instance, private schools in Delhi are on the verge of closing down if they were to actually fit into the RTE paradigm. So, I mean, we have a problem here. We have to understand a law cannot be imposed when it's actually doing the exact opposite of what you intended to do.
That's an interesting point, because Rukmini, I think you've made that point as well, that perhaps rather than giving a syllabus and having teachers teach that syllabus with no idea of students actually understanding, perhaps look more at going back to teach them how to read, teach them how to add, teach them how to subtract, rather than fit into demands of a syllabus and having no idea of it being done. Is that the kind of very basic rethink that needs to be done? It's not about the big picture here in that sense, but changing it from the very from the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are some fundamental building blocks we have to have in place. Whether you get them by the time you are 7 or 8, or, I mean, this is not HIV, this is not a disease. I mean, you can learn these things even if you haven't learned them earlier. And I think what our report does is really focus on two basic things. One is, can you read? Because as soon as you can read, you can actually propel yourself through the system quite well. And the other is sort of the basic foundations of arithmetic. Do you have number knowledge? Can you do basic operations? If these two pieces are not in place, then it's very difficult to make progress. So if I'm in 5th standard and I have a good 5th standard teacher, let's say I have a teacher and she does come to school every day, what she will be doing is teaching from the 5th standard textbook. But I'm still really at a much more basic level, and therefore the what she teaches passes me by. And as a result of which, the teachers feel disheartened. They feel they're working hard, but it isn't having any impact. Children feel that this place is not for me, and parents get upset that school mein padhai nahi ho rahi hai. And really what it is that you're trying to fit an age grade curriculum which may be great for middle class kids, may be great for other contexts, but not right for the reality where we are today. And therefore, I mean, our feeling is that if there were some simple learning goals, one of the things about Asar is the tool is very simple. And when you take it and you do it in the villages, often parents will say, "Acha, padhai matlab ye." because they think that schooling is equal to learning. And we now know that you can have very high rates of schooling in terms of enrollment, but on the learning front, you need to carry people along. You need to be able to explain what it is that kids need to be able to do and at what stage.
Do you find a willingness to listen to what you're saying? Pallam Raju says that he prefers a government survey. He sees it as a dipstick. He sees yours as a dipstick survey. Education, of course, also a state subject. So this is something you have to battle with bureaucracies and governments across states. Do you find a willingness to listen to what ASAR is actually saying?
We find actually a great deal of openness in the states. I mean, the center has a different role, the states have a different role. As Pratham, we work in collaboration, and we have done with many states. And I think that at the state level, for example, many states are now doing their own state level surveys. And one of the things that we find several states have done, some in collaboration with us and some on their own, is that fundamentally if children can't read, you can't give them a pen and paper test. To answer a pen and paper test, you have to actually be able to read what the questions are and then be able to do it. Now, Bihar recently has done a state level assessment in which they have done a reading test, an oral math test along with a pen and paper test. Rajasthan has been conducting what they call Sambalan, which also has a reading component. In Gujarat, Gunotsav had a whole variety of things that they did, including being able to ask kids to read. So I think, there have to be, I'm not against the fact that you need to test kids at grade level, because there are a bunch of kids who are at grade level, but a huge majority are well below grade and without the basics. And so if we start with where the kids are, we are likely to make far more progress than if we start with where the curriculum is and try to get at the kids.